So what lens should you get first? Okay, so part of this might just have to do with what's in your budget, right? Because if you don't have a lot of money, you're going to try to probably just get the best bang for your buck that you can maybe do the most with, or at least do the best of what you want to do, right? So essentially, if you want just an all-around general lens, probably like a medium range zoom lens is a good idea. So typical zoom range is a 24 to 70. Keep in mind, if you're on a crop sensor, that's going to be more zoomed in than an actual 24 to 70 full frame equivalent field of view, right? So that might sound complicated. I've talked about this previously, but anyway. So if you're getting your new camera set up and everything and you don't have a lot of budget, another thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is if you kind of want to just have some auto settings, it's a good idea to get an electronic lens. Electronic doesn't always necessarily mean expensive. So for example, the Canon 50mm f1.8, that's a pretty cheap lens with a pretty tiny aperture number, and it's electronic, so you get the autofocus on there if you want. And it's a pretty small lens. Again, it's cheap compared to other stuff. And so that also might be a good starting lens, but keep in mind that's a prime lens, so it only has one focal length. You're stuck with that 50mm field of view, which again, if it's on a crop sensor, is punched in further, is like more zoomed in than 50mm. So keep that in mind, because if you want to do some wide field of view, that lens is going to be harder to kind of get any kind of wider shot with. You're going to have to like step back more, and maybe in some cases you don't have a lot of room. So it's worth keeping that in mind. If I'm going to just make a recommendation, just look at a reasonably priced zoom lens, somewhere around 24 to 70 millimeters, ideally with a pretty good aperture rating. If your budget's really tight, don't worry about the aperture rating. When I say that, how I'll describe aperture rating is essentially, is it an f2.8 constant aperture, which means it stays at f2.8 through the entire zoom range, or is it like a 3.5 to 5.6, where at the widest it's 3.5 and at the most zoomed in you could only put that number as low as 5.6. So then if you are zooming in and out and you have it always set at whatever the lowest possible aperture is, it's going to get like brighter as you zoom out and darker as you zoom in. If you're doing video stuff, that might be looking kind of weird. So keep that in mind, because if you want it to stay the same level of brightness, like the same aperture value, then you'd have to set it to the highest aperture in that that rating, right? So if it's 3.5 to 5.6, you'd have to have it set at 5.6 if you didn't want to change its brightness level throughout the zoom range. Now there's other ways that you, like there's another way you could compensate for that. If you have like other auto exposure settings on, then it will kind of auto adjust for the darkening or brightening, but it might look weird if the auto settings are not super quick, because then you might see it get dark for a little bit and then bright pretty quickly, and it might just be weird. It might look weird. So again, if you could get like a constant aperture zoom lens where it's like f2.8 or f4 constant throughout the whole zoom range, then that might be more preferable. But that's probably going to be more expensive of a lens than the 3.5 to 5.6 or whatever version. So again, keep the budget in mind. It might just be worth saving up a little bit more money and just springing for a little bit better of a lens, just to kind of have that ease of use, or have that usability, or that whatever you want to call it, rather than having maybe some of the frustrations that come with having a cheaper lens that doesn't have the same aperture abilities. Because if you're filming in more low light scenarios, especially on an older camera that maybe doesn't have as good features for low light, or if you want a really blurry background, it's just going to be more challenging to get that if you don't have something with a lower aperture rating, and stuff like that. Like, there still might be ways that you can get the blurry effect, but you might have to do different things, like be closer to the subject. But again, what is the minimum focusing distance of the lens? In other words, how close can you get where the lens can still focus on that subject? Because some lenses might not be able to get super close, right? And then some lenses maybe have a macro capability where you can get closer or whatever. Keep all this in mind. Did I answer that question? Yeah, so for your first lens, keep these things in mind. At the end of the day, your decision. But if you have other questions, feel free to join my Skool community. Link in description. Feel free to ask questions there. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.